There is a version of American military aviation that appears in no official record, received no public funding debate, and for decades produced no photograph, no congressional testimony, and no admission of any kind. The aircraft in that version of history flew over American cities, crossed international borders, and in some cases fought wars, while the government that built and operated them told journalists, legislators, and foreign governments that they did not exist. This is not a story about technology. Every program in this video was ultimately a story about money that officially was not there, facilities that did not appear on any map, and the specific, uncomfortable moment when the denial became impossible to maintain. What follows is that story, told through 14 vehicles, funded across 7 decades by a black budget that at its peak consumed nearly $80 billion in a single year. Groom Lake, or How to Build a Secret. In 1955, CIA and Air Force officials conducted an aerial survey of the Nevada desert and selected a dry lake bed called Groom Lake for one specific reason. Nobody lived near it, nobody flew over it, and it sat directly adjacent to a nuclear testing facility that already kept civilians at a distance. President Eisenhower personally approved the acquisition. Engineers and contractors moved in during July of that year. They called it Paradise Ranch, a name chosen to make the posting sound appealing to reluctant workers. It was not a ranch. It was the infrastructure of invisibility, and it would serve as the proving ground for nearly every aircraft in this video. What the facility generated almost immediately was a secondary problem nobody had fully anticipated. The U-2 Dragon Lady, Lockheed's high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft developed under CIA program Aquatin, made its first flight at Groom Lake on the 1st of August 1955 and did so accidentally. The aircraft became airborne during a high-speed taxi test before the pilot intended. That unplanned moment was the beginning of the most consequential spy plane program in history. The U-2 flew at altitudes approaching 70,000 feet, well above the operational ceiling of every Soviet fighter and surface-to-air missile of the mid-1950s. Its first overflight of the Soviet Union came in July 1956 and produced, according to a declassified CIA assessment, what was immediately the most important source of intelligence on the Soviet Union that the United States possessed. The coverage of Soviet airfields, missile installations, and industrial infrastructure was unprecedented. Nothing else could reach those targets. The U-2 also generated a problem that became impossible to manage. Operating at those altitudes, at speeds and angles no commercial aircraft of the era could match, it was cited repeatedly by airline pilots and civilians across the western United States throughout the late 1950s. The Air Force's official position was that the observers were mistaken. A declassified CIA history later confirmed that the government had formally attributed many genuine U-2 sightings to natural atmospheric phenomena in order to protect the program. The UFO reports accumulating in Nevada during those years were, in a significant number of cases, a classified American aircraft. On the 1st of May 1960, a Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile struck Francis Gary Powers's U-2 at approximately 70,500 feet over Sverdlovsk. Powers survived, parachuted to the ground, and was captured alive. The State Department had already issued a cover story about a weather research aircraft. Then Nikita Khrushchev revealed that Powers was in Soviet custody, that his aircraft had been photographed largely intact, and that he had confessed. The Eisenhower administration had no version of events left that was both accurate and deniable. It was the first public acknowledgement in American history that the United States had been conducting systematic, covert aerial espionage against another nation. It would not be the last time a downed aircraft ended a lie. Mach 3 and the Art of the Cover Story. The Powers shoot-down did not end American aerial reconnaissance over denied territory. It changed the engineering requirement. The next aircraft had to be so fast, so high, and so difficult to track that losing one became operationally improbable. Project Oxcart was the response. Initiated in 1957 and managed by the CIA rather than the Air Force, a deliberate institutional separation designed to preserve deniability, Oxcart produced the Lockheed A-12, an aircraft built of 93% titanium, capable of sustained flight above Mach 3.2 at altitudes exceeding 85,000 feet. The A-12 presented manufacturing problems that had no existing solutions. Titanium at that scale required new tools, new fasteners, and entirely new fabrication processes, most of which were themselves classified. At operational speed, the aircraft's skin heated to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit from aerodynamic friction. It was fueled with JP-7, a specially formulated, low-volatility propellant that would not ignite on contact with superheated surfaces. The aircraft had to reach altitude and allow its skin to thermally expand before it could be fully fueled, because the titanium panels were deliberately built with gaps that sealed only when hot. The A-12 flew its first operational deployment over Vietnam and North Korea beginning in May 1967. Its existence was not officially acknowledged until 1981, 13 years after the program ended. In the interim, the government needed a way to explain aircraft sightings without explaining the A-12. The solution was the YF-12. In February 1964, President Lyndon Johnson publicly announced the existence of the YF-12, an interceptor variant of the same basic airframe, and confirmed its speed and altitude records. This was a deliberate disinformation exercise. By giving journalists and foreign intelligence services a known, acknowledged variant to point to, the administration could deflect questions about what else was flying out of the same facility. The YF-12 was real. It flew, it held records, and it functioned as a public distraction from the operational A-12 that was the actual intelligence asset. The A-12 family produced two further classified variants that took the program's ambitions to an extreme that bordered on the unreasonable. The M21 was a two-seat modification of the A-12 airframe designed to carry a separate drone aircraft on its dorsal spine and release it at speeds exceeding Mach 3. The concept: launch an expendable, unmanned reconnaissance vehicle over denied territory, recover its film canister mid-air, and leave behind no evidence of American involvement. No crew in the target area, no aircraft to recover or photograph, no pilot to capture. The drone was the D-21, code-named Tagboard. It was air-breathing, ramjet-powered, capable of Mach 3.3 at 90,000 feet, with a range of 3,000 nautical miles. On the 30th of July 1966, a D-21 collided with its M-21 mothership immediately after separation, destroying both aircraft and killing Launch Control Officer Ray Torek. The air launch program ended that day. The D-21 was subsequently modified to launch from B-52 bombers under program name Senior Bowl. It flew 4 operational missions over China, beginning in 1969. All 4 aircraft were lost, 1 to Chinese air defenses, 2 to mechanical failure, and 1 that overshot its recovery zone, crossed into Soviet airspace, and landed in Siberia largely intact. The Soviets reportedly reverse-engineered what they found. The program was terminated in 1971. The aircraft that replaced the A-12 inches public awareness was the one the public actually got to see, at least partially. The SR-71 Blackbird entered service in 1966, and unlike the A-12, it was eventually acknowledged. Its performance figures were openly discussed: Mach 3.3, altitudes above 85,000 feet, a standard evasion tactic against incoming missiles of simply accelerating. In its entire operational life, no SR-71 was ever shot down or destroyed by hostile action. Approximately 4,000 missiles were fired at SR-71s across their service history. None hit. The aircraft retired in 1990, was recalled to service in 1995 when satellite coverage proved insufficient for time-sensitive collection, and was retired again in 1998. The operational SR-71 was simultaneously the most photographed reconnaissance aircraft in history and one whose actual mission profiles remained classified for decades. Its fame was also its function, a spectacular, acknowledged program that drew attention away from whatever was flying alongside it in the black. The mathematics of invisibility. In 1964, a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev published a paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was a theoretical treatment of how electromagnetic waves interact with surface geometry. Soviet military planners found it too abstract to be useful. They largely ignored it. A Lockheed mathematician named Denis Overholser read a translation in 1974 and understood immediately that it was a formula for building an aircraft that radar could not see. The program that resulted was Have Blue. Initiated in 1975 by DARPA and the Air Force, it asked a question no aviation program had ever formally posed. Could a combat aircraft be shaped so precisely that its radar return dropped below the threshold of operational relevance? Lockheed's Skunk Works submitted a design that its own aerodynamicists acknowledged was aerodynamically unstable. It could not be flown without continuous fly-by-wire computer input. But its faceted surface geometry, each flat panel angled to deflect radar energy away from the source rather than reflect it back, produced a radar cross-section smaller than a steel marble. The first Have Blue prototype flew at Groom Lake on the 1st of December 1977. It was the first aircraft in history whose stealth geometry had been mathematically calculated before the aircraft was constructed. Previous low observable research had worked empirically, building shapes and measuring their returns. Have Blue was different. The answer existed on paper before the aircraft existed in metal. Both prototypes were eventually lost in crashes, the first on the 4th of May 1978, the second on the 11th of July 1979. Both pilots survived. More importantly, both aircraft had generated the flight data needed. The wrecks were buried at Groom Lake rather than recovered and transported for study, a disposal decision that reflected the classification level of the program and a specific concern. Reconnaissance satellites, including Soviet ones, passed over Nevada on predictable schedules. There could be no visible wreckage. While Have Blue was proving the concept at Groom Lake, a parallel program was testing a completely different approach to stealth at the same facility. The Northrop Tacit Blue was a battlefield surveillance demonstrator, built not around faceted panels, but around continuously curved surfaces whose radar-deflecting geometry required supercomputers to calculate. Program insiders called it the Whale and the Alien School Bus. It weighed enough and looked strange enough that both names were accurate. Tacit Blue flew 135 times between February 1982 and 1985 with a radar cross-section that program documentation described as smaller than that of a bat. Its engineers decorated their office walls with whale imagery and referred to themselves as whalers. Nobody outside the program knew why. The aircraft was testing something specific, whether a low observable platform could also use an active radar, transmitting rather than just receiving, without revealing its own position. A technology called low probability of intercept radar. The answer was yes. Tacit Blue's curved surface geometry directly influenced the aerodynamic and stealth design of the B-2 Spirit bomber, the YF-23 prototype, and every American low observable design that followed. The aircraft that shaped the future of stealth was classified until the 30th of April, 1996, 11 years after its last flight. By the time the public saw it, the technologies it had validated were already operational. Have Blue's validated geometry led directly to a production aircraft. The F-117 Nighthawk, powered by two non-afterburning General Electric F-404 engines, whose exhausts were shaped into cooled, flattened slot nozzles to minimize infrared signature, first flew at area 51 inches, June 1981. It was immediately classified at a level that prevented its existence from being acknowledged even to most of the Air Force itself. For its first 7 years of service, the F-117 flew exclusively at night. Its pilots were stationed not at a conventional Air Force base, but at Tonopah Test Range, officially listed as test pilots on unspecified research programs. When asked, the Air Force said nothing meaningful. In April 1986, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger overruled a proposal to use the F-117 strikes on Libya, specifically because any operational use would force public acknowledgement of the aircraft's existence. The secrecy was judged more valuable than the capability. A civilian photograph taken near the Nevada range eventually made the question of secrecy moot. The Air Force acknowledged the aircraft's existence in November 1988, 7 years into its operational service, and staged a carefully controlled public rollout at Palmdale, California. Camera positions at the event were arranged so that no journalist could photograph the aircraft from the rear. The government was simultaneously revealing the F-117 and concealing the specific technical details that made it work. It flew operationally for 27 years, including its first combat use in Operation Just Cause in Panama in December 1989, before being formally retired in 2008. $2 billion per aircraft, and a budget nobody could read. The black budget grew during the 1980s at a rate that even its architects found difficult to disguise. In 1981, classified Pentagon spending stood at approximately $5.5 billion. By fiscal year 1987, it had exceeded $22 billion, a 300% increase in 6 years. Congressional budget analysts, studying the discrepancy between total Air Force procurement spending and the programs they could actually identify, began publicly speculating about a stealth bomber program years before the government confirmed one. The money was disappearing into line items with no names attached, and the gaps were too large to be explained by anything the public record could account for. The program those gaps were concealing was the B-2 Spirit, the result of a black budget effort that ultimately cost $44.75 billion for 21 aircraft, approximately $2.1 billion per airframe. The B-2 was a flying-wing stealth bomber whose design drew directly on the curved surface geometry that Tacit Blue had validated. Where the F-117 was angular and faceted, the B-2 was smooth, continuous, a single arching shape that presented an almost unmeasurable radar return from the front. The B-2's first public rollout came on the 22nd of November, 1988, at Northrop's Palmdale facility, 3 days after the F-117's existence had been acknowledged. The timing was not coincidental. The Air Force had decided that a controlled double release was preferable to a slow unraveling. The rollout ceremony was staged so that journalists were positioned only in front of the aircraft. Photographs of the B-2's exhaust system, whose configuration was classified, were not obtainable from the approved viewing area. The aircraft was presented to the world with its most sensitive technical detail pointing away from every camera in the room. Its first flight followed on the 17th of July, 1989, with a chase aircraft positioned to block rear-angle photography throughout. The B-2 entered service, conducted its first operational combat missions over Kosovo in 1999, and flew 30-hour round trips from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to strike targets in Serbia and return without landing. The logistics of those missions, the tanker support, the mission profiles, the weapons employed, remained classified long after the flights themselves were publicly confirmed. Between the F-117 and the B-2, there was one more demonstrator program that the public never saw coming. The Boeing Bird of Prey flew 38 times at Area 51 between 1996 and 1999. Named by its engineers after the Klingon warship from Star Trek, a name that proved easier to remember than its formal designation, the aircraft tested a novel single-piece construction technique designed to eliminate the radar-reflecting panel gaps and seams that limited stealth performance in earlier designs. When Boeing declassified and publicly revealed it in 2002, they described it openly as a low observable technology demonstrator. That candor was unusual. It was also possible only because the technologies the Bird of Prey had validated had already been transferred to other classified programs whose existence Boeing could not discuss. The demonstrator went to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson, where it now sits on display next to Tacit Blue, two aircraft that shaped the operational fleet nobody was allowed to photograph. Unmanned, unacknowledged, and eventually paraded on television. By the 1990s, the logic of black aviation was shifting. Manned stealth platforms carried one irreducible risk: a pilot who could be captured, interrogated, and displayed. The U-2 program had demonstrated exactly what that looked like. The next generation of denied area reconnaissance was unmanned, and its development followed the same pattern as every program before it: secret development, covert operation, accidental public exposure. The RQ-170 Sentinel was developed by Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works and first flew in December 2005. It was a flying-wing stealth drone, low observable, jet-powered, designed for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in airspace where being seen was not survivable. The Air Force did not acknowledge its existence until after a reporter for Air Force Times published a photograph of an unidentified flying-wing aircraft on the flight line at Kandahar Airfield, Afghanistan, in 2009. The official statement that followed ran to one paragraph and answered no questions. Personnel in Afghanistan had already given it a name: the Beast of Kandahar. On the 2nd of May 2011, an RQ-170 orbited at approximately 9.5 miles above Abbottabad, Pakistan, providing real-time video of a residential compound to the White House and Pentagon while Navy SEALs conducted the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. The drone's presence over Pakistani airspace, a country whose government had not been informed of the operation, was not disclosed until after the mission's success had been announced. On the 4th of December 2011, an RQ-170 conducting surveillance over Iran was captured near Kashmir in northeastern Iran, approximately 140 miles inside Iranian territory. Iranian forces had reportedly used Russian-supplied electronic warfare equipment to disrupt the drone's GPS navigation, causing it to execute an autonomous landing protocol rather than crash. The aircraft came down largely intact. On December 8th, Iranian state television broadcast footage of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei personally inspecting the captured vehicle. The image was broadcast globally. The United States initially claimed the drone had malfunctioned over Afghanistan. That position lasted approximately 72 hours before the geography of the capture site, combined with the drone's condition, made any alternative explanation operationally incoherent. The RQ-170 incident was, structurally, the same story as the U-2 shootdown 51 years earlier. A classified American surveillance platform operating over a country the United States was not at war with was captured by that country's forces and displayed to the world on television. The government initially denied what had happened, then ran out of deniable alternatives. In May 2014, Iran announced it had completed a domestically reverse-engineered derivative of the captured drone. The intelligence program intended to monitor one nation had handed that nation a technical baseline. It would spend the following decade developing into an operational weapons system. The X-37B orbital test vehicle exists in a different category from every other program in this video. It is real, it is acknowledged, its launches are publicly announced, and its missions are classified in their entirety. Built by Boeing and operated by the United States Space Force, the X-37B is the only known operational military spaceplane in existence. It is a reusable, unmanned vehicle that launches on an Atlas V rocket, conducts operations in low Earth orbit, and lands autonomously on a runway like a conventional aircraft. Its missions have lasted between 220 days and 908 days, the latter figure representing more than 2.5 years in orbit, during which time the Air Force described its purpose as conducting responsible, innovative, and affordable space experimentation, a formulation that has not changed across any of its mission cycles, and that conveys, deliberately, nothing at all. The X-37B's existence is public. Its orbital parameters have been independently tracked by amateur astronomers using ground-based telescopes and published openly online throughout multiple missions. What it does in that orbit, what it carries, what it photographs or tests or deploys has never been disclosed. The same institutional architecture of denial that governed U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union in 1956 now governs a vehicle that operates 250 miles above the atmosphere. The budget that does not end. Every program in this video followed the same arc: secret development, covert operation, exposure on someone else's terms, and then belated acknowledgement shaped to minimize the damage. HAVBLUE validated stealth geometry in 1977 and was never publicly revealed at all. Tacit Blue flew its last mission in 1985 and stayed classified for 11 more years. The F-117 flew operationally for 7 years before anyone outside the program saw a photograph. The A-12 ended its service in 1968 and was not acknowledged until 1981. The D-21 flew classified missions over China and was compromised when the Soviets recovered a nearly intact vehicle in Siberia. In every case, the public record and the operational record occupied separate timelines, and the gap between them was measured not in days but in years or decades. The RQ-180 sits at the current edge of that pattern, developed by Northrop Grumman and discussed with increasing specificity by aviation analysts since approximately 2013. It has been described as a large flying wing stealth drone with significantly greater survivability than the RQ-170. It appears to have succeeded. The classified answer to the lesson the CIA learned when Iran walked away with their last one. The RQ-180 has never been officially confirmed. Its existence is known within the defense community. Its acknowledgement has not yet been judged necessary. The black budget for fiscal year 2019, combining the National Intelligence Program and the Military Intelligence Program, reached $81.1 billion, the largest classified spending request in American history. For comparison, the entire defense budget of most NATO members fits comfortably inside that figure. In 2020, the Air Force flew demonstrators from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman for the Next Generation Air Dominance program. None of those demonstrators has been photographed. None has been officially described. Unknown numbers of classified prototypes flew over American airspace during that evaluation period, and the public learned nothing about them. The pattern this video has documented is not a historical curiosity. It is not a Cold War artifact that ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. The black budget is larger now, in absolute terms, than it was when the U-2 was built, when the A-12 was flown, when the F-117 was hidden at Tonopah, when the B-2's exhaust section was pointed away from the cameras at its own rollout. The institutional architecture that made all of those programs possible, the classified line items, the special access programs, the facilities without addresses, and the aircraft without designations, is intact, funded, and active. From a dry lake bed in Nevada in 1955 to an orbital vehicle conducting undisclosed operations 250 miles above the Earth, the through line is not technology. The technology changed with every program. The through line is the decision made at the highest levels of government in every decade across 70 years that certain things should not exist in the public record until the government decides they should. The 14 vehicles in this video are the ones that decision eventually released. The number of programs still behind it is unknown. That is the point.